In early 1943, German fighter pilots laughed when they first saw the American P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft looked oversized and blunt, next to the slender Messerschmitt Me-109. They called it the Flying Jug, a nickname used to dismiss rather than respect. In a war where climb rate and acceleration decided survival, the Luftwaffe assumed that something this heavy could not contest their altitude, their tactics, or their control of Europe's air routes. Under the thick skin, however, was a different idea of air combat. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial gave the Thunderbolt hard power and reliability. Armor plates and self-sealing tanks kept pilots alive. Its air-cooled design tolerated hits that crippled liquid-cooled enemies. Most of all, in a steep dive, it gained speed that the German fighters could not safely match, and 8 50 caliber guns delivered a brief, decisive burst. Within months, the reports changed tone. Escort formations of Thunderbolts arrived high, struck fast, and returned to altitude before interception. German pilots who had mocked the Flying Jug now watched it pull away in dives, rejoin, and repeat. The balance over France and the Low Countries began to shift. The question was no longer whether the P-47 could fight, but how quickly it would erase the Luftwaffe's advantage. By early 1943, German fighter wings still dictated the rhythm of the European sky. Interceptors launched from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands to meet American bombers over the Channel approaches and the Ruhr. Jagdgeschwader equipped with the Messerschmitt Me-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 used altitude, discipline, and short communication lines to break daylight formations. Loss reports from the 8th Air Force grew each week and confidence inside the Luftwaffe remained firm. Across Britain, Allied planners faced limits they could not ignore. Daylight precision demanded close escort, yet existing fighters lacked reach. The Spitfire excelled over home waters, but could not accompany bombers to targets deep inside occupied Europe. Crews flew without protection through belts of flak and into prepared fighter zones. The result was predictable. Damaged aircraft straggled, isolated groups were cut apart, and navigation to the target became a secondary struggle to survival and return. In Washington and at Wright Field, the requirement was stated in clear terms. The force needed a fighter that could climb to high altitude, endure sustained power settings, and fight after hours of cruise. It had to survive hits, carry heavy armament, and operate in winter airfields with minimal support. Republic Aviation's answer was the P-47 Thunderbolt, wrapped around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial. The air-cooled engine removed coolant vulnerability and allowed emergency power without the same risk of failure. Design choices favored endurance over elegance. Self-sealing tanks limited fire, armor-protected vital systems, and a broad wing carried ammunition for 8 50 caliber guns. Structural strength permitted steep dives that exceeded the safe envelope of opponents. Drop tanks under development promised extended range without permanent penalties. Ground crews reported that battle damage often ended in maintenance rather than loss, a detail that mattered when sorties were counted in hundreds each month. Doctrine adapted as airframes arrived. Early units trained to meet interceptors above the bombers, attack once with concentrated fire, then use dive speed to disengage and regain altitude. Radio procedures tightened to control large escorts across long routes. Intelligence plotted German readiness cycles and radar coverage to reduce exposure. Each measure alone was modest. Together, they formed a path to restore freedom of action for the bomber force. By the spring campaign, the situation was set. The Luftwaffe still held the initiative, but the Americans now fielded a fighter built for the mission they had chosen. The contrast was simple and decisive. Short-range defenders against a growing escort arm that could arrive high, strike fast, and stay. The stage for reversal did not depend on surprise or rhetoric. It rested on production, logistics, and a machine that matched the distances of the war to come. In the spring of 1943, the campaign in the air reached a hinge. The Allies required control of altitude to make any invasion of Western Europe practical. Daylight precision could force industrial failure, yet without escorts, the plan produced ledgers of loss. The question narrowed to means and timing. either build a shield strong enough to cross the frontier by day or postpone the war's central decision. At High Wycombe, the 8th Air Force framed the requirement in plain terms. A viable escort must climb to the bomber lanes, hold station for hours, and fight with weight left in reserve. The Spitfire's range ended where the danger began. Early P-38 and P-51 allocations were thin and not yet integrated. The platform available in strength was the new P-47 Thunderbolt. First impressions were skeptical. On the ramp, the aircraft looked heavy and blunt, and early climbs did little to change opinions. Test sorties at altitude told a different story. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial delivered reliable power in thin air, and the air-cooled design absorbed hits that crippled liquid-cooled opponents. Most critical, the Thunderbolt gained speed in a steep dive that German fighters could not safely match. Doctrine formed around those facts. Rather than turn with interceptors, P-47 pilots would fight vertically. They would wait high, descend in coordinated pairs, fire brief centered bursts, and break down to regain energy before climbing back to station. Brevity codes were tightened. Timings were drilled until the climb, the pass, and the recovery felt like one motion measured on a clock. On April 8, 1943, Thunderbolts crossed the French coast on their first combat sweep. The task was to arrive before the bombers, clear the approaches, and hold the high lanes open. German controllers scrambled from Pas-de-Calais and the Low Countries. The first contacts were cautious, then the pattern appeared. Escorts struck once, broke cleanly, and returned from above before defenders could reform. Early results were mixed. Range limited time over target, and several flights reached fuel minimums at the edge of safety. Yet the airframe showed its purpose. Aircraft returned with skins stitched by fragments, while engines ran evenly to the chocks. Debriefs recorded short bursts from 8 50 caliber guns and a refusal to accept turning fights where the defenders' strength lay. Commanders adjusted schedules to the platform. Formations stacked in altitude layers, bombers on planned heights with Thunderbolts offset above and ahead. Rendezvous points moved westward to preserve fuel for combat. Maintenance standardized armor repairs and tank inspections to shorten turnarounds. None of these steps drew notice outside the groups. Together, they extended daylight reach by the measure that mattered, which was survival. Through May and June, the method hardened. The 56 Fighter Group, under Colonel Hubert Zemke, became a reference for disciplined vertical attack. Pilots learned to read the first German dive, hold fire, meet the second approach with a brief strike, and depart immediately. The intent was not display. It was the removal of a threat and a clean return to altitude before the next merge. Across the channel, the Luftwaffe altered its rhythm. Controllers staggered takeoffs to place fresh pairs above the stream. Leaders tried to draw escorts into horizontal contests where the Me-109 held an edge in climb and initial acceleration. When Americans declined, defenders followed dives and lost wings to stress or position to energy. Orders circulated warning pilots not to chase P-47s downward. Logistics moved with doctrine. Drop tanks reached the line in greater numbers, adding miles in steady increments. New radios reduced garble at the merge. Armor kits and self-sealing improvements arrived from depots. Each change was small. The sum pushed the escort line deeper into occupied Europe, and crews who had flown unprotected felt a weight lift from the long legs to and from target. By midsummer, planners built raids that assumed reliable cover on the most dangerous segments. The escorts were still finite, and weather still ruled, but daylight operations no longer paired certainty with loss. Intelligence mapped German readiness cycles and radar arcs, altering routes to stress the same units across successive days. Pressure replaced reach as the defining word of the schedule. Several actions showed the shift in plain form. Over Rouen and near the Zuiderzee, interceptors reached the stream and found escorts already poised above them. American fighters broke attacks, drove defenders down, and returned to post. Bombers crossed flak belts with gaps counted in single aircraft rather than entire elements. Reports from German fields noted pilots unsettled by the speed of the dives. Training absorbed the pattern. New crews learned that patience and position beat impulse and turn. Gunnery emphasized brief converged fire rather than long chases. flight leads enforced fuel discipline and the exact second to leave a fight to preserve altitude and convoy. The escort arm settled into a calm that matched its aircraft, heavy, stable, and repeatable under stress. Industry underwrote the change. Republic plants delivered airframes on a schedule the Defender could not match. Spares and engines moved with the groups, turning battle damage into serviceable metal. The effect was not dramatic in a day, it was visible in a month, as squadrons maintained strength while opponents measured availability against fuel, parts, and hours on type. German answers mixed skill with necessity. Some units adopted head-on attacks to force bombers to break. Others waited near flak belts to pin escorts and open the stream to a second wave. Mixed elements paired Focke-Wulf 190s for disruption with Messerschmitts in pursuit. These methods earned results, yet none restored the early certainty that daylight boxes would shatter on contact. Weather remained the common adversary. Cloud decks split formations and hid threats until the last mile. Icing reduced climb rates and frayed rendezvous. In that uncertainty, the Thunderbolt's mass traded agility for stability, a bargain that favored an escort role. Crews learned to treat the sky as a system to manage with fuel, timing, and patience, rather than an excuse to abandon the plan. By late summer, a decision long debated became settled practice. The 8th Air Force would keep daylight bombing as the primary instrument against the German war economy, and it would do so under escort in depth. The commitment did not rest on slogans. It rested on production tables, maintenance logs, and the observed behavior of a fighter that arrived high, struck fast, and stayed long enough to matter. The air war's tone changed with that commitment. Interceptions still cut hard when weather and timing favored the Defender, and rookies still made fatal choices inside a merge. Yet the background moved. Where escorts held altitude in layers, loss ratios bent downward. Where range forced gaps, they rose. Each added mile of Thunderbolt reach placed more of the route in the first category. Act Y closes with a new rhythm rather than a single victory. Escorts met the stream, interceptors rose to meet them, and the balance in each clash tilted by fractions toward the side that could absorb damage and return the next day. The trial of an ungainly aircraft had become an organized method, and that method set conditions for the harsher exchanges that followed. By midsummer of 1943, the pattern of contact hardened. Radar posts along the channel traced long American streams climbing in layers, and German controllers lifted interceptors from fields in France and the Low Countries. The escorts now arrived in depth. The P-47 did not promise elegance. It promised to be present when the Defender turned toward the bombers. The first large collisions over Rouen showed the method. Messerschmitt pairs descended in slashing attacks to split the boxes. Thunderbolts weighted high, rolled, and delivered brief-centered fire. Each pass ended with a clean break and a measured climb back to station. The aim was not a duel. It was to remove weapons from the merge and preserve altitude for the next gate. German leaders adapted quickly. Some sections used offset approaches to avoid the American counters. Others tried to draw escorts into horizontal turns where the Me-109 still held an edge in climb and initial acceleration. The Americans declined and fought vertically. In steep dives, the Thunderbolt gained speed that German fighters could not safely match without risking structure and control. Airfields recorded the cost of misjudgment. Pilots who followed Thunderbolts down exceeded limits. Wings failed, canopies tore free, and engines over-revved in thin air. Jagdgeschwader orders circulated with explicit ceilings for pursuit. The rule was simple: break off below given speed and height. The penalty for ignoring that rule arrived with the recovery teams that counted broken airframes. Logistics moved with tactics. External tanks reached the groups in greater numbers, each shipment adding miles to the radius that mattered most. Maintenance standardized armor repairs, control surface swaps, and fuel system checks to shorten turnarounds. Radio drill tightened. Mission briefs set altitudes, timing gates, and rally points to reduce waste and to concentrate cover where the bomber stream was most exposed. Zemke's 56th Fighter Group became a benchmark. Pairs worked like tools. Leaders set convergence ranges, enforced fuel margins, and taught new pilots to end a pass on time. Debriefs replaced anecdote with numbers, entry height, angle, burst length, and time on station. The culture shifted from displays of nerve to measurable execution that survived the week as well as the hour. The Luftwaffe still struck hard. Veteran aces led formations that could cut a bomber element in a single coordinated pass. Yet every month the price rose in fuel, spares, and experience that could not be replaced at the front's tempo. Serviceability on forward fields slipped. Pressure from the east drew away mechanics and parts. The defenders fought well with less, and less did not stretch. American planners widened contact. Fighter sweeps moved ahead of the bombers to thin patrol lines and strike airfields at sensitive hours. The Thunderbolt proved stable and punishing at low altitude. 8 50 caliber guns tore into parked aircraft, locomotives, and soft transport. The damage seldom decided a day. It decided schedules over a season, which was the measure that campaigns obey. Several actions marked the shift in plain terms. Above the Zuiderzee, escorts met staggered German attacks with repeated vertical breaks and returns. Over Emden, a series of short, hard passes dismantled a coordinated intercept before it could reform. In both cases, the bomber stream crossed flak belts with losses counted in single aircraft rather than entire elements broken out of shape. Ground crews measured progress in metal rather than claims. Airframes taxied in with skins stitched by fragments and small caliber hits. Air-cooled engines ran evenly despite punctures and oil streaks across the cowlings. Self-sealing tanks turned fires into leaks and leaks into landings. Repair lines, not headlines, kept squadrons on the line and pilots in the briefings for tomorrow. Intelligence layered its own contribution. Analysts mapped radar coverage, takeoff intervals, and vector habits at specific fields. Routes bent around those habits. Timing was shifted to hit the same squadrons on successive days, denying them the chance to rebuild readiness. The objective was not a single clear victory. It was a tempo that the defender could not sustain without breaking something needed later. Weather remained the common adversary. Cloud broke formations and hid threats until the last mile. Icing reduced climb rates and made rendezvous fragile. In those margins, the Thunderbolt's mass traded agility for stability, a bargain suited to escort work. Crews learned to treat the sky as another system to manage with fuel and timing, rather than a force that excused disorder. Training absorbed the lessons with quiet insistence. New pilots learned to count seconds in the pass, not frames in the sight. Gunnery emphasized brief, converged fire at planned ranges. Flight leads drilled fuel discipline and the exact moment to leave a fight to protect altitude and the convoy. The tone became professional calm, the habit of people who intended to be present again tomorrow. German commanders searched for counters that fit dwindling means. Mixed elements paired Focke-Wulf 190s for the first blow with Messerschmitts in pursuit. Some units used head-on attacks to force bombers to break and to draw escorts down. Others waited near heavy flak belts, using ground bursts to pin the Americans. None proved decisive once escorts held altitude and depth. By autumn, range and procedure carried the escort line toward deeper targets in the Ruhr. Each mission still cost aircraft to flak and fatigue. Mid-air collisions in cloud remained a threat. Yet packages returned often enough to plan the next day without rewriting doctrine. Continuity, not spectacle, created space for the bomber force to act with growing freedom. On the return legs, opportunity met design. Thunderbolts dropped to rail lines and road junctions. Locomotives stalled under concentrated fire. Bridges carried scars that forced detours. Convoys dispersed at the first engine note. Those reactions consumed fuel and time was the resource Germany no longer owned. The air arm that once set the pace now reacted to it in smaller circles each week. Claims and counters diverged in paperwork as they do in all wars. The patterns did not. German units reported more aborted attacks under escort pressure. American groups recorded fewer sudden collapses of entire boxes. The graph changed shape. Peaks of loss flattened, and the mean bent downward where range and altitude were maintained. Arithmetic, not rhetoric, defined the trend. Individual skill still decided seconds inside a merge. German aces continued to score. American rookies still died when they turned flat or stayed too long in a dive. Yet the system around those moments grew stronger on one side and thinner on the other. The gap was not in will. It was in fuel allotments, training hours, and a machine that forgave errors long enough to learn. As winter approached, escorts arrived not just in numbers, but in layers. One group covered ingress, another the target window, another the egress. Handoffs improved as controllers learned when silence served timing better than talk. Leaders left fights on the second to be present at the next gate. The bomber stream felt steady cover rather than dramatic rescue, which is what plans require. Several debriefs captured the season in a single line: formation held. That sentence explained the purpose behind every adjustment. The object was not to win duels on the edges. It was to keep the convoy intact, deliver weight on target, and return crews in numbers to fly again. The Thunderbolt's traits aligned with that object without apology or flourish. German fields told a quieter story. Mechanics stripped airframes to keep leaders flying. Training flights shortened as fuel allocations fell. New pilots launched into weather and contact with hours that would once have been judged unsafe. Those facts appeared not in announcements, but in the widening space between sorties planned and sorties flown across the week. The daily grind produced a statistical truth. Where escorts held altitude and depth, bomber loss ratios declined. Where range forced gaps, they rose. Each extension of Thunderbolt reach shifted more miles into the first category. That shift defined the meaning of the season more clearly than any list of claims. Superiority emerged not as an event, but as a background condition. By year's end, commanders planned sequences rather than spikes. Raids stacked across days exploited damaged defenses. Fighter sweeps caught units turning aircraft between sorties. The defender still fought, but the pace no longer belonged to him. Initiative lived with the side that could schedule pressure and keep appointments across a continent in winter. What began as ridicule resolved into procedure. The ungainly escort built around a radial engine imposed its logic on the sky. It dived faster than pursuers, endured damage that grounded competitors, and carried enough fire to end a pass in seconds. More important, it returned to station again and again until the defender met exhaustion as a daily fact. The outcome of Act II was not a coronation. It was a method proven under strain. Escorts high, brief strikes, disciplined recovery, and unbroken presence over the most threatened legs. Within that method, the Luftwaffe's margin narrowed month by month. The next phase would ask whether an air force under pressure could still concentrate for decisive defense, or whether escorted daylight would carry the campaign toward collapse. By early 1944, the air war in Europe entered a phase that measured strength and endurance rather than display. American bomber streams stretched for miles, layered with escorts that arrived high, struck briefly, and returned to station. The Luftwaffe still climbed to meet them, but each interception consumed fuel, pilots, and time that Germany could no longer replace at the required pace. Operation Argument, later called Big Week, set the rhythm. For several winter days, factories, assembly plants, and repair depots across Germany received repeated daylight blows. The Luftwaffe replied with massed sorties and fierce coordination. Losses were heavy on both sides, yet when the weather cleared again, the escorts returned, and the damaged lines struggled to resume their former output. Behind the combat reports stood arithmetic. Fuel allocations fell, training flights shortened, and new pilots reached the front with hours that would have been considered unsafe 2 years before. Mechanics stripped one airframe to keep another flying. Experienced leaders rotated constantly, and every absence, whether for injury or fatigue, left a gap that younger men could not yet fill. The Thunderbolt's role hardened. It remained an escort first, but it also became a tool of pressure on the ground. On egress, flights dropped to strafe locomotives, bridges, and columns. 8 heavy guns punished movement, and the effect rolled forward along rail lines and roads. The war economy did not stop in a day, but it began to miss connections that once had seemed routine. German commanders searched for methods to slow the attrition. Some units tried head-on attacks to force bombers to break. Others timed merges near flak belts to pin escorts. Mixed elements paired Focke-Wulf fighters for the first cut with Messerschmitts in pursuit. These choices produced local successes, but the strategic curve remained. The defender fought harder to achieve less. Spring brought another shift. dropped tanks, extended escort depth, and coordination across groups improved. Communications shortened to essentials. Leaders left fights on the second, not the minute, to meet the next rendezvous gate. The presence of cover became a condition rather than an event. For crews in formation, that constancy changed expectations from endurance to execution. On the ground, transport targets multiplied. Rail yards filled with damaged rolling stock. Bridges carried fresh scars. Convoys learned to move at night and to scatter at the first engine note. The more often this happened, the more fuel and time vanished into defensive routine. The air arm that once seized initiative now reacted to it day after day in smaller circles. None of this erased cost. Escorts fell to flak to weather and to mistakes inside, merges measured in heartbeats. Bomber groups still reported days of sudden loss when a formation met guns and cloud in the same minute. The system held because it could absorb those shocks and return with similar weight the following morning. That was the advantage that mattered most. In June, the story met the coast of France. The invasion required a ceiling of protection that denied the enemy the power to concentrate. Thunderbolts flew armed reconnaissance over roads and hedgerows, breaking columns before they reached the line. Air superiority did not make the landings easy. It made them possible, and it kept the battlefield supplied while the front spread inland. Through summer, the Luftwaffe still appeared without warning. Veteran aces led sharp attacks and found victories when weather or fatigue opened a seam. Yet each success came with a price. Replacement pilots arrived with limited hours, and serviceable aircraft were rationed by fuel and spares. The escort layers above the bomber stream did not vanish, and the rail lines below did not heal. In late summer and autumn, attacks on the transportation network tightened the loop. Thunderbolts worked the edges of cities and the junctions between them, cutting switches and locomotives with short, precise runs. The cumulative effect restricted mobility. Ground divisions waited for supplies that did not arrive, and the defenders in the air rose from fields that could not support sustained effort. The Luftwaffe's answer mixed courage with necessity. Dispersal spread aircraft across many strips, complicating logistics and diluting concentration. Night movements conserved fuel but raised risks. Training units fed the line. Each measure kept the fight alive, but at the cost of depth. The force survived contact, yet lost the reserves that make recovery possible after contact. Winter returned with sharp air and narrow margins. Escort plans layered groups across ingress, target, and egress, and the handoffs grew cleaner. Controllers learned the value of silence. Leaders learned the moment to abandon an engagement to meet the next gate on the clock. The bomber stream recorded fewer breaks in formation, and fewer breaks meant more bombs placed as briefed. On the first day of the new year, a desperate German strike sought to punish Allied air power on the ground. The attack caused local damage, but cost experienced pilots and scarce aircraft. The balance that mattered did not move. Within days, the escorts and the bombers resumed the schedule that had become the war's metronome, and the defenders counted what they could still fly. Attrition now spoke in quiet terms. Sorties planned exceeded sorties flown by margins that widened each month. Fields reported aircraft grounded for lack of parts that had once been common. Fuel trains destroyed one morning, reduced patrols 2 days later. These small facts, taken together, defined collapse more clearly than any single dramatic engagement. Through it all, sacrifice remained visible. Thunderbolt squadrons posted empty chairs after missions that ended in smoke or silence. Crews remembered calls that stopped mid-sentence and formations that turned with sudden gaps. The aircraft's survivability brought many home, but not all, and the ledger of loss filled line by line without ceremony. By early 1945, air superiority had become steady background rather than contested foreground. The Thunderbolt was no longer an experiment or a surprise. It was a reliable machine in a reliable method, flown by units that measured success in formation lines unbroken and supply lines cut. The Luftwaffe still rose, but the time it could spend in the air and the mass it could gather had shrunk beyond recovery. The campaign's conclusion offered no single coronation. It presented a field of continuing work. Escorts high and present, bombers en route and on time, transport targets struck on return legs, and enemy airfields kept under pressure. What once required extraordinary effort now proceeded by plan. The strategic result was not a moment. It was the absence of the opponent at the place and time of decision. For the Thunderbolt, this was the measure of its design. The air-cooled engine endured punishment. Armor and self-sealing tanks forgave errors that would have been fatal in lighter types. 8 heavy guns delivered short, decisive bursts. Most importantly, the aircraft returned to station after contact and then returned again the next day. In that cycle, the war in the air was decided. When the front on the ground advanced, it advanced beneath a sky shaped by this routine. Bridges were crossed because roads to them were spared attack, and columns reached assembly areas because reconnaissance held the approaches. Air power did not close battles alone, but it set the terms under which they could be closed. The collapse of the defender's air arm fixed those terms. Act 3 ends with a plain record. The force that began the war with initiative met a system that survived loss, learned quickly, and grew stronger as it fought. The Luftwaffe's courage was not in doubt. Its means declined beyond rescue. The American escort arm, with the Thunderbolt as a constant, pressed until the sky above Europe belonged not to laughter or to claim, but to schedule, wait, and return. In May 1945, the airfields of the Reich fell quiet. What had begun as a contest of claims ended as a record of absence. Interceptors no longer formed over the river valleys, and radar rooms watched empty screens. The Allies held the routes, the altitudes, and the schedule. Air superiority was no longer argued. It was the condition under which the war concluded. The Thunderbolt's path to that moment was practical, rather than dramatic. Introduced as an ungainly escort, it matured into a system aircraft, durable, repeatable, and present where decisions were made. Its radial engine resisted damage, its armor forgave mistakes, and its 8 heavy guns imposed short, decisive contacts. Pilots learned to work in that logic and returned to station after contact. Production told the parallel story. Republic plants delivered more than 15,000 airframes in less than 3 years, a tempo Germany could not match. Spares, engines, and repair kits moved with the groups, turning damage into serviceable metal at a rate that kept squadrons on the line. The outcome was not a single leap in capability, but a sustained ability to show up. Strategic effects reached beyond the cockpit. Once escorts held the high lanes, bombers placed weight on plants, refineries, and rail centers with greater regularity. On return legs, Thunderbolts strafed locomotives, bridges, and road columns, narrowing the defender's options. The front on the ground advanced beneath a sky that punished movement and made regrouping difficult. The Luftwaffe's decline remained a human story. Experienced leaders fell, and replacements arrived with hours too few for the tasks ahead. Mechanics worked from stripped airframes and partial kits. Fuel trains destroyed on one morning reduced sorties 2 days later. Courage did not diminish, but means did, and by winter the balance could not be repaired by effort alone. For crews who flew the Thunderbolt, survivability was not a slogan. Air-cooled engines ran with holes that would have ended liquid-cooled types. Self-sealing tanks turned fires into leaks and leaks into landings. Many pilots credited the aircraft with the simple fact of being present at debrief. Others did not return, and their absence remained the quiet cost of the method that won the sky. Doctrine carried forward lessons that outlived the war. Range and endurance mattered as much as turn and climb. Vertical tactics beat impulse turns. Radio brevity and fuel discipline saved formations as surely as gunnery did. These habits, formed in the escort role, shaped the transition to jets, where speed increased but the value of procedure and presence did not change. The Thunderbolt's legacy was also industrial. It demonstrated that a nation could field a heavy, complex fighter in numbers large enough to influence strategy, then keep it supplied across oceans and seasons. That capacity, planning lines, training crews, and repairing at scale, proved as decisive as any single engagement. It was an argument made in schedules and shipping lists. When peace returned, the aircraft left European skies with little ceremony. Museums kept a few examples, and air forces moved on to swept wings and new engines, yet the pattern it set endured: designed for survival, build for repetition, and place strength where decisions are made. Under those terms, ridicule had no leverage. Under those terms, the flying jug became proof rather than promise. In the record of the war, the P-47 stands as a practical answer to a hard problem. It did not win by elegance, nor by a single day's tally. It won by arriving, striking, and arriving again, until the opponent could not meet the appointment. The laughter that greeted it in 1943 faded into respect, and respect into the quiet fact of a sky no longer contested. By late 1944, the air over Western Europe settled into a pattern that favored the Allies. Escort layers arrived on time, bomber groups held formation, and German interceptions grew shorter and thinner. The P-47 had done its work: protect the stream, punish movement, and return often enough to keep pressure unbroken. The Luftwaffe still appeared in sharp bursts, but fuel, spares, and training hours could not sustain a recovery. The campaign's center of gravity now lived with the force that could schedule contact and keep it. Across the Pacific, a different problem waited. Japan's A6M0 and dense island defenses demanded fighters that could live with carrier cycles, long legs, and rough fields. The F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair answered that call, while the P-51 Mustang carried range where land bases allowed. The method learned in Europe, altitude and depth, radio brevity, disciplined dives, moved with them. The next chapter follows how those tools closed a wider ocean, from the Marianas to the Philippines and toward Okinawa, and how air superiority again set the terms for battles decided on the ground and at sea. Between 1943 and 1945, Republic Aviation built more than 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. Powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800, Double Wasp, the type exceeded 400 miles per hour in level flight and reached higher speeds in safe dives. With external tanks, combat radius passed 400 miles, enabling deep escort to targets in the Ruhr and beyond, and allowing return leg strikes on rail and road movement. The Thunderbolt served chiefly with the 8th and 9th Air Forces in Western Europe, and with the 12th and 15th in the Mediterranean. Across all theaters, P-47 pilots were credited with more than 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, in addition to tens of thousands of vehicles, locomotives, and soft targets hit during low-level attacks. The aircraft's heavy armament and dive stability made these missions practical and repeatable across seasons. Among the most effective units, the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, recorded more than 600 aerial victories. Notable aces included Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, and David Schilling, each reaching over 20 confirmed kills in the type. Allied losses in Thunderbolts totaled roughly 3,700 aircraft, a figure tempered by high pilot survival rates attributed to armor, self-sealing tanks, and the resilience of the air-cooled radial. Key dates frame the record. The prototype first flew in 1941. Early combat operations over France began in April 1943. By late 1944, escorted daylight raids had become routine, and in May 1945, organized German air opposition effectively ended. In that span, the Flying Jug shifted from a ridiculed newcomer to a system asset whose presence helped decide when and where the war in the air was fought.